Hello guys! For your Module 5 of your Introduction to Game Concepts, our topic is regarding adventure game genre. So for the objectives, at the end of this lesson, students should be able to learn the following. First, learn what an adventure game genre is, learn the history of the adventure game genre, learn the game features and storytelling features of games under the adventure game genre. Lastly, learn the avatar movements in adventure game genre. So first, what are adventure games? Many video games don't need a story, but in adventure games, the story is the point, the main reason people play it. So basically, adventure games, guys, rotates on the story being told within the game. Okay? The focus will be more on the story aside or instead of the mechanics. So an adventure game is an interactive story about a character. Okay, that character will be the player's avatar or your avatar within the game. He is a fictional person in his own right, a protagonist, the hero of the story. So storytelling and exploration are essential elements of the game. Puzzle solving and conceptual challenges make up the majority of the gameplay. As compared to action games will rely more on the physical skills that the player can perform during the game. In adventure games, that will not be the case, okay? So, again, in adventure games, it rotates about the story being told. Okay, so the player will only be given few choices to take within the game, then those choices will define how the game will progress. Okay, in adventure games, the focus will be more on the mechanics. How are you going to play? What type of moves, action, movements are you going to perform within the game in order for you to win it? In adventure games, will depend on the storytelling, will depend on you as the character selecting the choices. Why? These choices within the game will define what will be the output of the game. Okay? So, combat and economic management and action challenges are reduced or non-existent to adventure games. The combat, the economic management, and action challenges will be more uh, seen in action games as compared to adventure games. So for the history of the adventure games, at the early days, the first adventure games were text only, which made them inexpensive to develop and allowed great scope for both the designer and the player's imagination. So the original adventure didn't have any plot. It just offered a space to explore and puzzles to solve. So as you can see, we've mentioned puzzles a lot, multiple times here already. Okay, so basically guys, in adventure games, one of its main characteristics will be solving puzzles within the game. These puzzles will let you progress to the game. So let's say for example, adventure games will implement different types of puzzles like you need to solve who's the murderer within the game, etc., etc. So those are types or those are the puzzles that we're referring into this game. It's not like playing Tetris or playing some other board games. Text-only adventure games have long ceased to be a commercial market, but they live as an art form for enthusiasts who are interested in the power of the written word in gaming. So this field is now called interactive fiction, and a number of free tools exist to help people create such works. So this will be an example of a gameplay or a GIF video showing the gameplay on how to play these text-only adventure games. So this particular game is what we call the Dream Hold. As you can see, you won't be seeing any player, any character, any monsters in here. All the user interface will show you or the game will show you will only be text. Okay? So basically, the story is being told, then you as the player are giving, the story is giving you choices. Okay? So those choices will basically define what will be the output of the story. Okay? Then, graphics changed everything. So, as soon as personal computers began to develop graphics capability, developers started to add graphics to adventure games, and the games really took off. So, adventure games provided challenges and explored areas that other genres didn't touch. So an example of an adventure game is The Mist. A point-and-click graphic adventure was for many years the best-selling personal computer game of all time, before it was superseded by the game The Sims. So the first graphical adventure games came with gorgeously painted but static backdrops for every scene that looked much like theatrical stage sets. So the players could only see a lot of things but could only touch a few of them. So again, the game Mist was the first commercial game to use 3D rendered backgrounds, owes some of its success to its sophisticated graphics. So this GIF or this video will show you the user interface that you'll be seeing within the game. Okay, so basically this is a point and click type of game. So what do we mean by point and click? So traditional games that or modern games that we play um, nowadays will require you to use the keyboard keys ASWD in order for you to navigate through the map, or basically to move forward, backward, sideways to navigate the map. In point and click games, in order for you to navigate the map, all you need to do is to click to a one particular location within the game. Okay, so by pointing it, the player or your avatar will proceed onto that location. Okay, by doing point and click, you are not free to navigate the whole map. Okay, the only accessible part of the map will be what the designer allowed you to do or allowed you to explore. It's not an open world type of game. Then came along adventure games, action adventure games. So the arrival of 3D hardware also gave rise to a new sort of game, a hybrid of action game and adventure game. So that is what we call now your action adventure game or action adventure genre. So these games are faster paced than a pure adventure game and include physical as well as conceptual challenges. So basically, action adventure games also rotate within the storytelling within the game. So that will be the feature that action adventure got from the adventure games. But in order for you to progress within the game, you need to do quest, okay? You need to solve puzzles, but along that, you'll also need to have physical skills to finish the game. Like action games, okay, so basically there will be more on fighting. Okay, you need to fight monsters in real time, like in fighting games, or you need to jump off from a building to another building, just like platformers, etc., etc. Basically, action adventure games will be a collection of different features that came from action games and adventure games. So basically, it has the features of action, fast-paced action from the action game and the storytelling feature from adventure games. So the Silent Hill and the Assassin's Creed series would qualify for example. So the modern Zelda games could be considered another example, although with their levels and bosses, they are closer to being pure action games. So action adventure hybrids are now more popular than traditional adventure games. Most of you guys will be familiar on these action adventure games as compared to traditional adventure games. So this is a GIF or a video of screen capture of the gameplay for the Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So as you can see, your avatar will need to rotate within the map, kill some enemies, accomplish some objectives, okay, in order for you to progress within the story. And today, so in the past few years, adventure games had begun to experience a rebirth, driven in part of the arrival of large numbers of casual players who aren't as interested in physical challenges or complex mechanics. So the adventure games also have diversified into a number of different forms. The first one that we have is mobile device games. On hardware like mobile phones and tablets, the point-and-click adventure game has found a new lease of life. Although their graphics and sound require a lot of storage, they don't need 3D graphics acceleration, so they don't run down your batteries too fast. Then, we also have your hidden object games. So while most adventure games use a variety of different kinds of puzzles, hidden object games concentrate on just finding one. On one, finding objects hidden in a complex visual environment. But it's not difficult to weave a story with this process, so particularly anything involving exploration or investigation. So the Blackwood and Bell Mysteries Facebook games work this way. So we have a screen capture on how this game works. So basically, this is a browser game wherein the game will let you find several objects. Okay, if you find those objects, then you can accomplish the task that is assigned to you. So this could be quest and etc. etc. So the main objective in the game is basically finding objects within the screen. So usually this type of objects will be hidden from plain sight. It's up to you, the gamer, on how are you going to find those hidden objects. Next, we also have your interactive books for children. So these have been around for years as PC games and often don't have much plot. They concentrate more on simple puzzles and visually appealing environments to explore. A great example of this kind of game is the Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Lesmore. So basically, guys, this is like a text-only adventure game that have images or graphics. Okay, so basically, it's like storytelling, giving you a limited choices to make within the game. Okay. Next, we also have multiplayer adventures. Journey, a game for PlayStation 3, may be the only game of this kind. So, it's a wordless online adventure game in which the player can interact with one other player on each level, but only via a musical chime or by moving around together. The player experiences a story of sorts, but it's largely created by his own activity. So the limited interaction guarantees that the player cannot say or do anything that is inappropriate for the narrative. So this is a screenshot or game capture of the game journey. So as you can see, within this game, you need to explore the map either in single player mode or multiplayer mode, okay, to collect these talismans and other objects within the game. Next, we also have your large semi-cinematic games. The large-scale adventure games has experienced a limited comeback recently in a new form with games like Fahrenheit, LA Noir, and Heavy Rain. Many of these lead the player more by the hand than the older point-and-click action games, offering a richer story while granting the player less freedom. They also make heavy use of quick-time events, moments in the game when the player must press the correct buttons immediately after an on-screen prompt in order to complete a task. I'll be asking you to play a game. The game is entitled um, The Wolf Among Us. That game will fall under this type of adventure game. So I'll be giving you the link later on where you can download the game. Okay, the Wolf Among Us. So this is a sample gameplay for the game Fahrenheit. Okay, it looks more cinematic as compared to those text only adventure games. Next, let's proceed with game features. In adventure games, the player's avatar visits an explorable area containing a variety of puzzles or problems to solve. Solving these problems opens new areas for exploration or advances the storyline, giving the player new information and new problems to solve. So that's how you progress within adventure games. You need to solve these problems, you need to solve these puzzles in order for you to progress to the next level of the game. So exploring the environment and manipulating items in it are essential elements of the adventure games. So next, we have setting and emotional tone. Unlike sport games with all the associated team management functions or war games with associated battle planning modes, adventure games don't need a lot of specialized screens. Apart from the need to look at the map or the avatar's inventory or to examine objects closely, the player always sees and interacts with the world in the same way, and that doesn't change from one end to the other. Okay? So the setting contributes more to the entertainment value of the adventure game than setting in any adventure or in any other genre. Whether it's grim and depressing, fantastic and outlandish, or funny and cheerful, the setting creates the world the player explores, lives in. So adventure games are almost single player games, so they can't rely on social interactions to create richness. Again, as we've mentioned earlier, adventure games focuses more on the story. It's how the game presents itself to you as the player that appeals to the players. Okay, it's not the combos you can make, it's not the high score that you can make, but it'll be more on the story, more on the storytelling. Okay, how the story is being presented to you as a player. So we have a sample screen capture in here of the gameplay for the game The Wolf Among Us. So this will be the introduction of the game. As you can see, the graphics will show you what type of setting or tone or emotion is being displayed onto the game. So as you can see, most most of the graphics you can see in here is more on the dark side, meaning uh, this is not a type of game that have a happy story. Okay, so more on the sad story because of the color being represented in here. Okay, so in this part of the game, you'll be investigating uh, who killed a character. So that will be the first mission when you're playing this game. Okay, so it's a bit more grim, particularly it'll be showing you a severed head within the gameplay. Next, you have your interaction model. So adventure games always use an avatar-based interaction model because the designer wants to put the player inside the story. That character or that avatar represents you as the player to be part of the game. Next, we have context-sensitive model. Using a context-sensitive model, the game depicts the avatar from whatever camera angle is most appropriate for his or her current location within the game. So for example, going into indoors to outdoors, the camera might move farther away from the avatar to show more of the environment. So let's say we have a screen capture in here. Okay, so this is a scene in a vampire story. So the lowered camera position accentuates the main character's height. Okay, to show the whole or to show most of the character. Then we also have third person perspective. So the third person perspective keeps the player's avatar constantly in view, as in Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb, an action-adventure hybrid. So this perspective is common for action-adventure games in which player might need to react quickly. Okay, so this is a screen capture of the Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb. So this is a typical action adventure perspective wherein you see the whole character, you see the environment. So if ever a monster or a character within the game will attack you, you'll see it immediately and you as the player can react accordingly. Next, we have player roles. So adventure games can be filled with all kinds of puzzles and problems unrelated to the player's stated role. So for example, Indiana Jones is supposedly an archaeologist, but we don't see him digging very much. So the role of the player in the adventure game arises not out of the challenges, but out of the story. Again, as I've mentioned earlier, adventure games focuses more and more on the story. A good many adventure games do connect the player's role with the game's activities. So almost all adventure games treat the story as a journey, mapping the plot of the story into physical travel through the game world, so the player's role often involves travel or investigation. So it explorer, detective, hunter, conquistador, etc., etc. These are the type of player roles that you can take within the game. Okay. So one way that the player enacts her role in adventure game is through dialogue choices. So adventure games usually offer the player many opportunities to interact with non-player characters, or we call them NPCs, by talking to them. So the player's choice of approach, it's either aggressive, polite, joking, so on, reflects the player's interpretation of the character, so it can change the plot line. Okay, in this part of the game, where in the game shows you the dialogue, it will be showing you choices on what to say to the NPC. Whatever choice that you make within the game mostly impacts what will happen to the story. Okay? It will vary depending on the choices that you will make within the game, how the storyline will happen. So in here we have a screen recording of the uh, game The Wolf Among Us. Okay, so let's replay that back one more. Okay, so as you can see, in this earlier part, these two characters are having a conversation. Then this dialogue will pop up. Okay, upon the storyline, okay, you need to answer or you need to select which is the best answer in these choices. Okay, these choices that are prompted to you will define the output of the storyline depending on the choices that you will make in this dialogue. So this is basically the gameplay that you'll be facing with adventure games. Okay, so The Wolf Among Us tells the player something about the consequences of a particular decision immediately, such as noting that she decided to avoid the fight or that the other character will remember that she decided to say something. Again, as I mentioned earlier, all the choices within the dialogue choices will define what will be the output of the story. Okay, every choices you make in the game is important because it will define what will be the output of the storyline. Next, story and spatial structure. Because adventure games map a story into a space, they establish a relationship between different locations in the world and different parts of the story. So the easiest adventure games, including the original adventure, emphasizes exploration at the expense of the story. So the game simply gave the player a large space and told him to wander around. So the structure of early adventure games will be something like this. Okay, each circle represents a room. S is the starting room and E is the end. So basically, the game designer will create different types of room and create different type of selections that the player can proceed, but will only offer one type of ending. It's up to the player how to represent all these rooms, all these stories, all this chapter within the game. Okay, he can explore unnecessary rooms like this. So basically, if you're starting in here and you want to proceed to the ending, you may not enter this room or proceed to this chapter because after finishing this story or this room there won't be a following. Okay, so it will end there. So this type of adventure games will let players just explore within the storyline. As adventure games became larger and began to include a more detailed story, designers started to break them into chapters. So the player could wander around all he liked in the area devoted to a given chapter, but when he moved on to the next chapter, the story advanced and there is no way back. If the player decided to take a particular object from one chapter to the next, the story would not let him progress until that object was in his inventory. Okay, so basically, it will be requiring you certain objectives to be accomplished before proceeding to the next chapter or before proceeding to the next level. So this arrangement is functionally identical to the story fallback structure. In a fallback story, the player has some dramatic freedom, but eventually his options narrow to a single inevitable event before they branch out again. So in adventure games, this inevitable event is normally the transition to the next chapter. Okay, so the structure of a story-driven adventure. So as you can see, this type of gameplay, the map or the rooms will be divided into chapters. The player in chapter 1 can only explore these rooms. Okay, if he wants to explore the rooms for chapter 2, he needs to finish the whole chapter 1. As you can see, the arrow that connects chapter 1 to chapter 2 will only have one direction, meaning if you proceed to chapter 2, you won't be able to go back to chapter 1. Unlike these arrows, meaning if you're in this part of the game, you can go in there, go in here, or go anywhere you want within chapter 1, but you can't go back a chapter. Okay? So with the arrival of 3D graphics and the action adventure, the stories became more linear still. With the arrival of 3D graphics and the action adventure, the stories became more linear. So, the space in action adventure structure is more like that of an indoor first-person shooter because action adventure emphasizes conflict challenges, often shooting or hand-to-hand fighting over exploration. So, the structure of action adventure games. So, it becomes more linear, but still it will be divided into several chapters. Again, the fallback structure looks something like this. Then your action adventure will also have some characteristics similar to the fallback. As you can see, within the chapter transition, you can only proceed to one single direction. Meaning, if you're in this part of the story or the chapter, you can't go back to the initial chapter or to the previous chapter. Next, we have your storytelling. So adventure games rely on storytelling more than any other genre. So this section introduces a few of the key features of storytelling and talks about their significance in adventure games. First, we have your dramatic tension. So dramatic tension, which arises from an unresolved situation or problem, is what holds the reader's attention and keeps her around to see how the story comes out. In adventure games, this often happens in a cutscene right after the beginning of the game. So what is a cutscene? So a cutscene is basically a cinematic wherein it will be shown at the start of the game in order for you to grasp what part of the story are you. Okay? So it will also give you the basic information of the premise of the story. So what scenarios already happen and where the story will take you. So you as the player, what are you going to do in order for you to solve this problem? So the meaning of the scene doesn't have to be immediately clear. So mystery and uncertainty may help set the mood for your story. So I'll be showing you a video of the game Admar. So basically this is a sample of a cutscene. It will be showing you the premise of the story.
Years passed, and the Viking warriors continued on their pillaging voyages and grew ever richer. The Viking chief was proud of his people, but he was greedy, single-minded. He wished to expand his village, regardless of the consequences. The chief despised Ardmar. He'd never fought for his village and survived off their scraps. But the chief would tolerate this behavior no longer. Ardmar would have to single-handedly loot the forest, burn it to the ground, so their village may prosper. And if he refused, he would face the same fate as his old friend Vaska. After being ridiculed by his village, Ardmar ran home to his hut. Ardmar felt hurt and lost. He loved his people, but he couldn't be what they wanted him to be. Perhaps he thought he wasn't a true Viking. Maybe some sleep would do him good. Ardmar couldn't believe his eyes. At his side was his long-lost friend Vaska. And in front of them stood the hallowed gates of Valhalla. "Wait!" cried Ardmar, as his old friend stepped into the light. In front of Ardmar appeared a strange apparition, a forest fairy. She condemned Ardmar's selfish ways and his squandered potential. He had let down those closest to him. He did not deserve a place in Valhalla. But she offered him a deal, a great power. If used correctly, perhaps he could earn his place in Valhalla, but at a price. Ardmar woke up with excitement. What a strange dream. It felt so real. And how did this pouch get here? Was this what he saw in his dream? He looked inside the bag. A mushroom?
Okay, so that is an example of a cutscene. So basically, that cutscene introduce you to the story and introduce you to the character Admar. So most of the time, adventure games will be utilizing this type of cutscenes to introduce the story to you as the player. Okay, so in adventure games, dramatic tension is created through the combination of dramatic storytelling and interactive puzzles. Impending doom that can be stopped only by the player's intervention can provide a dramatic point to the story as long as the player doesn't feel as though the tension is contrived. Next that we have is the heroic quest. So the majority of adventure games fall into the category of heroic quests, each one mission by a single individual to accomplish some great feat. Traditionally, the heroic quest involves a movement from the familiar to the unfamiliar and from a time of low danger to a time of great danger. Basically, in this type of stories, the character initially starts as an ordinary character or player within the game. So, but the story will be introduced, the conflict will be introduced, then your avatar or your character must go to a process of hardships, more and more hardships as the story progresses. Then he will come up as a hero that will basically defeat the enemy or finish the game or solve the problem. Occasionally, exceptions to this structure arise, such as in stories in which the hero is abducted at the beginning, escapes, and must return to his home. However, in these stories, the protagonist's struggles don't get easier until he just strolls in happily. He often returns home to find the things that have changed for the worse and must be corrected, or that he must live again to hunt down his abductor. Next that we have will be challenges. So the majority of challenges in an adventure game are conceptual puzzles that can be solved only by lateral thinking. So the following list of a few popular puzzles of the many types available will help get you started. First, finding keys to lock doors. So lock doors refers to any obstruction that prevents progress, and a key is any object that removes the obstruction. So because this type of puzzle is so common, the challenge for you as a designer is to give the players enough variety so that the door and key puzzles don't all seem to be the same. So in this type of games, the main objectives for these particular types of challenges is to basically to find an object within the game that will unlock the door. It could be a door within the game, it could be a chest within the game, or it could be a crime, or it can have many forms. So the basic idea is you need to find an object within the game, and using that object to progress to the next part of the game. Next, we have figuring out mysterious machines. This is in effect a combination lock instead of a lock with a key. The player manipulates a variety of knobs to make a variety of indicator show the correct reading. So try to make the presence of these knobs reasonably plausible. Too many adventure games include mysterious machines that clearly function only as puzzle and not as realistic parts of the game. So in here, instead of finding the keys, so this could be a combination lock wherein you need to find clues within the game that corresponds to a key to that lock. Okay? So it could be multiple locks that will be requiring you different type of keys or different type of clues within the game in order for you to unlock these mysterious machines. The next one is obtaining inaccessible objects. In this kind of puzzle, the player can see but not reach an object, which may be a treasure or a key to open some door elsewhere in the game world. So remember that this doesn't need to be an actual key. It could be any object within the game. Okay? It could even be a character within the game. So the player must find a clever way of reaching the objects, perhaps by building some device that gives her or him access to that object. Next is manipulating people. Sometimes an abstraction is not a physical object but a person, and the trick is to find out what makes the person go away or lets the player pass. If it's a simple question of giving the abstractor something he wants, then the problem is really just a lock and key puzzle. So the player should have to talk him to learn his weakness. These are often called dialogue puzzles because the player must figure out what or how to ask a question of an NPC to get the information that she wants. So basically, it's like a quest wherein you need to solve what will be the requirement of the game or this character in order for him or her to get or to get you to get so you can get past through them. Okay, so this is another type of puzzles. The next one that we have is navigating mazes. So uses mazes, confusing areas that make it difficult for the player to know where he or she or where to go sparingly. So a maze should always contain clues that an observant player can notice and use to help her learn her way around. So basically, the maze will be showing you some clues. It could be objects, it could be signage, or it could be NPCs that could direct you to a particular direction in order for you to get out of the maze. Next is decoding cryptic messages. So many players enjoy decoding messages as long as you give sufficient clues to help out. So basically, there could be certain clues within a room wherein the game will be asking you for a particular set of numbers wherein you can look numbers on magazines or could be on newspapers, etc., etc. Solving memorization puzzles. So these puzzles require the player to remember where something is or a variant of the game concentration. So she can usually defeat this by taking notes that reasonable enough. It's how we remember things anyway. Okay, so this type of challenge could be asking you where did you last see this thing or where did you last see this character, etc., etc. Next is collecting things. The player must find a number of objects. This may be scattered pieces of larger objects, a set of related items such as 12 identical gems, or simply miscellaneous treasures. So, in this type of challenges, you're basically collecting objects. So, most of the time, you'll be asked to collect certain objects within the game in order for you to progress to the next level. Next is doing detective work. So instead of solving a puzzle per se, the player figures out a sequences of events from clues and interviews with witnesses. So the situation doesn't necessarily have to involve a crime. You could use any unknown event. So detective works form the basis of many police procedure games. Okay, so if you'll be using a crime scenario, okay, so the game might be asking you who's the murderer based on the clues that the game provided you. Next game feature that we have is mapping. So players usually need to make maps for themselves as they went along because they found it difficult to remember how the rooms in the game world related to one another. So with the arrival of graphical adventures, mapping became less critical because graphics provide cues about how the player's current location relates to other areas in the world. So there are also some adventure games that implements maps or mapping system wherein you can basically know where you are currently located within the map of the game. Next is your presentation layer. So adventure games, more than most other genres, try to hide the fact that the player is using a computer. So when compared to vehicle simulators, sport games, or RPGs, adventure games offer clean, uncluttered screen. So you don't have heads-up display, you don't have the uh, icons or logos for your HP, for your skills, etc., etc. So the player needs to move through the world, talk to NPCs, and manipulate or collect objects using intuitive commands or actions that do not interfere with his sense of immersion to the story. So most of the time in point-and-click games, the player must click onto all the objects in order for him to explore all the possibilities that he can use in order to progress into the game. Next is avatar movement. So the movement interface that you design depends considerably on the perspective you chose. So when playing from a first person or third person perspective, the player needs a way of steering his or her avatar around the world, as in action games. So these types of avatar movements will be the following. The first that we have is your point and click interface. In this user interface, the player clicks with a mouse cursor or taps with his finger somewhere on the screen. So if the corresponding location in the game is accessible, then the avatar walks to it. So if the player clicks an active object, the player or the avatar walks to that object and picks it up or manipulates it in an appropriate way. It could be looking into an item, or it could also be using that particular item. So it will depend on the game on what command is to be executed if you click onto an item. So some games, if you click an item, you'll only be examining it. Okay? In some games, like in XCOM 2, if you tap onto a door, the door will be open. So it varies depending on the game. So the disadvantage of a point and click user interface is that the player can easily point to areas that aren't accessible to the avatar. So sometimes an area that looks as if it should be perfectly accessible is actually inaccessible, which can be frustrating for the player. So the point and click interface is an indirect control mechanism and was for many years the de facto standard for adventure games. It works well in traditional adventure games with no action challenges. Okay? So where these types of adventure games will most probably focus just on the story. So because traditional adventures are increasingly rare and that action adventure hybrids become more common, the point and click interface is gradually being replaced by direct control interface. Then the next type of avatar movement that you can do in adventure games and action adventure games will be the direct control interface. In a direct control user interface, the player steers the avatar around the game rather like driving a car. So on a console controller, the joystick or your D-pad normally manages this. On a personal computer, the mouse or the keyboard steers the avatar as in an action game. So if you're using a keyboard as an input for the game, most probably you'll be using the keys A, S, D, W to navigate through the environment or to navigate through the game. This is now the standard for action-adventure games, whether in third-person or context-sensitive camera models. This has the advantage that the game does not have to implement a path-finding algorithm. The avatar only goes exactly where the player tells it. Next, aside from the direct control interfaces and point and click, we also have the manipulating objects. So you as the player will have the privilege to manipulate or examine objects within the game. So typically the player must figure out what to do with the particular objects to solve puzzles and advance in the game. So in text adventure, this amounted to guessing the correct verb. So in adventure games, this is usually by clicking onto objects and selecting that object, then it will vary on the game what is to be displayed to you. So if you want to examine the object, do you want to use that object, etc., etc. Identifying active objects. With the advent of 3D model worlds and powerful physics engine, just about every object that's not part of the scenery can theoretically be manipulated or picked up by the avatar. So most objects in the scene don't actually play a role in the game. They're just part of the decoration set. So some games will allow you to pick them up, put them on your inventory, some don't. So the player needs a way of recognizing the active objects in a particular location. So text adventure used to print a list of active objects, but in graphic adventures, they typically use one of the four mechanisms. So these are those mechanisms. The first one is hunt and click. Active objects don't look any different from anything else. So the player simply has to click everything in the scene to see which parts are active. So if you click on the item and a menu pops up or the object zooms in, then that's an active object. This makes the scene look realistic, but the player may find it annoying, especially if some active objects are small or partially hidden, or if the environment shows you too many objects that you need to explore. Next is permanently highlighted objects. The active objects in a scene appear permanently highlighted to make them stand out from the background. So you can do this in a number of ways. For example, make them slightly brighter than the rest of the scene or surround them by a line of light or dark pixels. So the moment the scene appears on the screen, the player can tell which object are active. So it's convenient if artificial. Okay. So basically, in permanently highlighted objects, once you enter a room, you will automatically see that object is an active object because most probably it will be highlighted by some sort of a line or by a border, etc. etc. Dynamically highlighted objects. So the active objects in the scene normally look like part of the background but appears to be highlighted when the mouse cursor passes over them. So the main difference between your dynamically highlighted and permanently highlighted objects is in dynamically highlighted objects, it will only be appear to be highlighted if the mouse pointer passes over that object. It still requires the player to do some hunting, but hunting is much easier than hunting and clicking. So a quick wave of the cursor tells the player if there's an active object nearby. Then we also have your avatar focus highlighting. So this mechanism is typically used with handheld controllers when the player doesn't have a cursor. So as the avatar moves around, active objects that he comes near to are highlighted. So when he moves away, this highlighting disappears. A related form is focus of attention highlighting, in which the avatar must face the object as if paying attention to it. So those are the different types of object or those are different types of mechanisms that are being implemented to adventure games on how to find active objects. Next that we have under avatar movement will be one button actions. In a graphic adventure game played with a handheld controller, designers often assign one button of the controller to a generic use or manipulate function. So the player moves the avatar near the object and presses the use button for obvious functions such as opening a door or throwing a switch. So the player can always count on the button to do the right thing with an object, whatever that might be. So some touchscreens and mouse-based games use a similar mechanism that touching or clicking an object causes the appropriate action. So players find such games easy to play because there is no guessing about what can be done. Next, we have menu-driven actions. A number of games use a menu to allow the player to select which action to take and which object to manipulate. So this gives the player a clear picture of available choices, but the presence of the menu doesn't harm the player's sense of immersion somewhat. So locating the menu outside the main view of the scene will help with this somewhat. So you can use pop-up menus that appear only when needed. So let's say basically if you go into a particular place within the game or let's say within this room, you'll be prompted with these choices. Okay, so this is what we call menu-driven actions. So now you as the character can choose what to do based on these choices. Next that we have is managing inventory. So adventure games have always required the player to pick things up and carry them around until they're needed later. Most games present the player with a visible inventory mechanism. So usually a box that pops up on the screen and shows everything that the avatar is currently carrying. So the player will need to stop frequently for inventory management tasks. So you should make adding, removing, and viewing inventory items as easy as possible. So the longest journey included the convenient shortcut keys that allow the players to change the object currently being held in the avatar's hand without opening the inventory box. So allowing the player to manage the inventory with such shortcut keys also means that you won't have to create animations of the avatar picking up and dropping every possible item in the game. So that concludes our discussion for our adventure game genre. So the next part of this module is you guys will be playing the game, The Wolf Among Us. I'll be providing you the installer with of the game within the description of this video and in our Edmodo post. And some short announcement. There will be an assessment for Module 5. Okay, but the contents of the assessment will come from Module 4 and Module number 5. Okay, so that will be 40 items. So most of the items will be coming from this discussion of Module 4 and Module 5, but some items will come from the game that you're going to play. So in Module 4, I ask you to play the Metal Slug 3. Here in Module 5, I'll be asking you to play the game The Wolf Among Us. So I've already demonstrated you how to install the games in the previous module. So for now, guys, I want you to play the Wolf Among Us. If you have additional questions regarding the game, how to install the game, just send me a private message. So after playing the game, then you can proceed to the assessment. Before taking the assessment, make sure to play Metal Slug 3 and The Wolf Among Us. Okay, so that's all for module number 5. Thank you.